At noon, the world stopped feeling like anything it had promised to be. People who had planned their afternoons and their arguments and their errands found the calendar collapsing into a single instant. The sky above Earth did not rip open with the pleasant violence of thunder. It split with geometry. Pale triangles of light stitched themselves across the blue like a tailor running a rule across fabric. Orbiting transmitters, black and glinting, hung at the vertices and hummed a tone that was not music and not quite machinery. Then the voice came. It layered itself into every human tongue so that the syllables bypassed translation and landed straight in the throat. Earth, you will kneel. People dropped what they held. Tools clattered to dusty floors. Lunches went unchewed. A man in a suit of neat indignation froze halfway to a telephone that had never rung. The great capitals fell quiet as if someone had scoured the noise out of them. World leaders argued over the air because that was what leaders did. Admirals measured trajectories in their heads. Parliamentarians read the declaration and tried to parse whether it was a joke or an ultimatum. Scientists, blessed with the habit of reasoning, checked calibrations and whispered that the signal came from devices whose clockwork had been set by mathematics beyond their muster. Everywhere on Earth there was a whisper that ended in the same two syllables. Extinction. The word rounded in mouths like a coin someone had just decided could no longer be spent. In war rooms, men gestured at pins on maps, as if moving them could push back a sky that had already been rewritten. The galaxy's language, rendered as command, made humans feel small in the slow way of tidal forces and big machines. The Empire had authority the way a mountain has gravity. In the Mojave, at an airstrip that hardly counted on any map, a woman adjusted her aviator sunglasses and smirked. Darla Starr did not carry herself like someone who expected to live by a rule book. Her hair held the sort of perfect golden wave that made poster artists sigh and mechanics grin. Her flight suit was rolled at the sleeves because the arms of her life were always showing work. To a first glance, she was the sort of image plastered on bomber noses and barroom calendars. She smelled faintly of oil and aftershave and something sharp and citrus that was probably lipstick. When the Earth heard the demand to kneel, Darla laughed. The sound was half challenge and half amusement. Kneeling was not in her vocabulary. She had knocked the word out of 5 men with her left hook alone, and had once refused to take off her goggles in the face of a hurricane because she liked the way it felt when the weather tried to rearrange her hair. The arrivals above were careful to be terrifying. Their transmitters broadcasted geometry as if to show off their control of the cosmos. The voice was precise and without sentiment. They meant to order obedience. They expected compliance. Instead, they met human faces turned up in disbelief and anger, and a woman in sunglasses who spat polish and grit like she spit chewing tobacco, only refined. To the Imperial mind, a planet that produced pinups could only be decorative. To Earth, it produced farmers and coders and mechanics who knew their machines in a way that made them intimate. The Empire had catalogued humanity by observation satellites and assumed that this was a species to be arrayed like beads. They had not charted the human tendency to answer insult with imagination. They had not counted how pride could metastasize into cunning. The first acts of resistance were not battles. They were gestures. Radio amateurs tuned transmitters to jam the Empire's channels. Farmers drove their tractors toward communication towers and set them to emit static that tasted like old records. Truck drivers who had spent half their lives judging distance moved supplies in ways the Empire could not predict. In 1,000 small places, the human impulse was the same. They refused to kneel and stood crooked and stubborn in the face of a voice meant to fold them into silence. On the Mojave airstrip, Darla accepted no lecture and made no appeal. She saw the grandeur of the geometry and the arrogance that had authored it. She saw an alien pride that needed to be provoked. Her hands moved like the hands of people who had spent their youth learning to keep complicated things flying. She walked across cracked concrete to a bomber that had been patched and repatched until people swore it would fly only in somebody's imagination. The plane smelled like history and kerosene and a jukebox that had been cannibalized for wiring. It had a nose painted with a grin. It had a radio whose knobs had been turned by fingers that understood how to coax rebellion from metal. There was no decree for her to follow. There was no plan neatly folded and waiting in a drawer. There was only a decision the size of a fist to be clenched. In a world that had been designed for obedience, Darla chose improvisation. She took the bomber and turned the airstrip into the first act of argument back at the sky. A ragged crew found their way to her, a mechanic who could weld an argument out of scrap, a pilot whose best days were supposed to be behind him, a young woman who spoke computer code, like scripture. They joined because resistance did not look like a policy. It looked like a party, and a mutiny flung together in one breath. And so the first chord of the rebellion was struck not with a weapon, but with audacity. The bomber spat engines and rose. Above, the Empire's transmitters triangulated and called for compliance in voices that tasted like cold iron. Down below, in the belly of a patched-up plane, a woman in sunglasses grinned when the first volley of targeting lights washed over them. She leaned forward and thumbed knobs, and somewhere among wires that hummed with old music she heard the world answer back. There would be strategy later, there would be doctrine and countermeasures and the long mathematics of war. For the moment the work was simple. It was about holding your nerve when the sky tried to press your face into the soil. It was about laughing and pushing the throttle forward because sometimes that is what courage looks like. Darla had no illusions about being a general. She knew how to fly, and that was often enough in a universe that prized algorithms over improvisation. Algorithms could not predict a grin. Algorithms could not read the line of a joke. The Empire would learn that the hard way. This is where the story begins. Not in capitals or on polished platforms, but at a cracked airstrip and a woman who refused a beautiful command. Humanity had been told to kneel and chose to do something stranger. It reached for a control stick and stole the first step of a future that would look different from any map the Empire had designed. The sky held its geometry for a moment longer and then woke to find a bomber passing through it like a needle through fabric. The thread of resistance was pulled tight, and the rest of the stitchwork would have to follow. The Empire's ultimatum arrived like a protocol packet made flesh, precise, impersonal, and final. It did not invite negotiation, debate, or even comprehension. It presented obedience as a binary state and extinction as its only alternative. In that mechanical cadence, the universe's hierarchy was stated without rhetoric, the language of control rather than persuasion. For ordinary people, the message collapsed time. Markets stopped, radios hung on a single syllable, and the public moment condensed into a decision between awe and terror. Scientists could trace the mathematics behind the broadcast. Diplomats could debate implications, and yet none of that softened the blunt moral arithmetic the Empire offered. Faced with authority that spoke as if written in geometry, communities felt their agency diminish, and, paradoxically, began to imagine the forms resistance might take. The broadcast froze public life into a tableau. Commuters halted. Factory shifts paused mid-routine, and the machinery of governance clicked into emergency mode. In corridors of power, ministers and admirals traded grim calculations, while below them ordinary people registered the threat in smaller, actionable ways. A shared silence sheltered private panic and practical thinking at once. Behind the global stillness, networks of improvisation began to form. Amateur radio operators tinkered with transmitters to create noise walls. Farmers and truckers rerouted convoys away from monitored highways. Mechanics and shopkeepers repurposed parts and tools to rig jammers, antennas, or covert beacons. Trust narrowed to hands you had shaken and faces you recognized. These mundane adaptations, jammed frequencies, clandestine routes, whispered contacts, would become the scaffolding of resistance. On a scrubbed airstrip in the Mojave, Darla Starr's smirk reframed the ultimatum. Where governments weighed risks in minutes and models, she treated the Empire's demand as an insult to be answered with improvisation rather than treaties. Her expression was not absence of fear, but a tactical choice. defiance as the first maneuver. Her smirk galvanized the small and scattered into action. A patched bomber, a ragged crew, and a set of cobbled instruments became a counter-argument broadcast into the triangles of light. The gesture contained more than bravado. It transmitted a cultural message that refused to accept planetary obedience as inevitable. By turning a command into a dare, Darla reframed the conflict from abstract calculus into a human tale of risk, improv, and laughter, making resistance feel possible and contagious. When formal arsenals failed to match the Empire's precision, scavenging became a doctrine of its own. Barns and junkyards were combed like armories, corroded radomes, pickup truck alternators, and rusted antenna masts were reimagined as components of electronic countermeasures. What had been scrap in peacetime was now raw material for deception. Fieldcraft grew from habit and necessity. Mechanics taught farmers how to retune tractor magnetos into pulse generators. Radio amateurs learned to splice old radar dishes into makeshift reflectors. Teams practiced the art of masking and mimicry. Sheet metal decoys, improvised reflectors, and repurposed wiring that made a freighter look like a meteor. The result was a strategic mosaic, no single factory output, but a planet-sized patchwork that could sniff, confuse, and mislead the Empire's clean, overconfident algorithms. Sound gear and sentimental hardware turned out to be unexpected weapons. Jukebox motors, tone arms, and phonograph amplifiers were rewired to produce broad-spectrum noise and deliberately skewed harmonics. Those warm, analog signatures bled into the Empire's targeting logic, which expected the mathematical sterility of machine voices and steady carrier waves. Amateur transmitters and hacked broadcast towers layered music, static, and microbursts into coordinated patterns that looked like traffic to Imperial sensors and like chaos to their prediction models. Engineers used tempo changes, mechanical flutter, and deliberate pitch drift to create false Doppler reads and phantom flight corridors. In short, Earth turned nostalgia into obfuscation. The jukebox's crackle became a cloak, and a scratched single could hide an entire squadron. Darla's crew were not generals, picks. They were misfits pulled from margins. Pilots with stories too wild for peacetime airlines. Grease-streaked tinkerers who spoke in bolts and swear words. And teenagers who read code like scripture. Their training was informal, their loyalty born of shared risk rather than orders. That ragged skill set proved advantageous. Where doctrine demanded neat plays, the crew trusted gut and improvisation. A mechanic's intuition about a failing valve could save a mission just as a hacker's offhand exploit could blind a cruiser. They worked through jokes and cigarette smoke, trading bravado for results. In a universe of algorithms, human unpredictability, reckless, loud, and stubborn, became their deadliest asset. Darla's flying turned the sky into theater and a puzzle the Empire's targeting engines couldn't solve. Her loops were not textbook aerobatics, but improvisations, tight corkscrews, sudden slips, and faux stalls that painted false vectors for gimbaled turrets. Automated systems expected predictable arcs and statistically probable trajectories. They were trained on fleets that moved like metronomes. Darla's moves created transient blanks in those models, so targeters either tracked ghosts or hesitated long enough for her gunners to find openings. Her crew treated each sortie like jazz, call and response maneuvers, spontaneous feints, and ragged timing that turned precision into paralysis. Even captured flight data later read like art, not doctrine, baffling technicians who tried to reduce her to equations. The Empire's supremacy rested on precise mathematics, probability thresholds, error margins, confidence intervals. Humans introduced what those systems treated as noise, purposeful misreads, signal clutter, and timing irregularities that turned clean equations into messy histograms. Darla and her crew weaponized errors. They fed hacked broadcasts, decoy pings, and jukebox-sourced modulation into targeting arrays, forcing classification routines to flip states. Friend became ambiguous, hostile signatures blurred, and the anti-collision logic stalled to avoid catastrophic friendly fire. Delays in decision cascades are decisive. A fraction of a second's pause let a human hand find a weak seam in armor or a tow cable sever a turret. The Empire had built a clockwork galaxy. Earth threw a handful of grit into its gears. Those grains decided battles. Darla realized that the Empire's authority depended as much on image as ordnance. A seamless, implacable voice that told entire worlds to kneel cultivated a myth of inevitability. She pierced that myth with ridicule. Using stolen comms, she broadcasted taunts, old radio jingles, and her own smooth drawl into Imperial channels, turning declarations into punchlines. That contagious mockery seeped through occupied networks, making stationed crews second-guess orders and commanders fumble protocol. Mockery worked alongside other tactics. It lowered enemy morale, emboldened civilians, and turned local skirmishes into spectacles. A laughing planet is harder to subdue. Contempt corrodes the mandate to obey. Darla's broadcasts were not just insult. They were strategy, a social weapon polished to a shine. They made resistance fashionable. The bomber's takeoff was an argument made in motion. Engines coughed, then roared, and the patched hull climbed through the Empire's clean geometry like a hand drawing a crooked line on a ruler. Where commands expected surrender, motion demanded attention. Fear that had pooled in doorways and basements turned into fuel and thrust. Around the strip, small gestures multiplied. Radio hams tuned their dials into humming static to confuse the transmitters. Farmers drove tractors to jam antenna farms at dusk. Couriers threaded convoys across backroads, carrying parts and hope. Each act alone was a nuisance. Together they formed a strategy humans had never planned on paper. Improvisation became doctrine, and the world learned that resistance could be 1,000 tiny refusals stitched into something unstoppable. The Empire's analysts treated humanity like an experiment. Variables measured, behaviors catalogued, outcomes predicted. They excelled at pattern recognition, but mistook recurring routines for immutable laws. Playfulness, improvisation, stubbornness, those messy cultural variables, didn't fit neatly into their models, so they were discounted. Where an algorithm expected compliance, humans produced jokes, gambles, and shortcuts that broke assumptions, like static through circuitry. More damning was their image of Earth as ornament rather than actor. Observational satellites saw pin-ups and pop culture and turned that surface into a conclusion, a species too decorative to resist. The Empire confused aesthetics for incapacity and failed to foresee that a perfume bottle can hide a bomb or that a smirk can presage a coup. Underestimating hearts and grit is a strategic error the stars never forgive. Symbols accelerate movements. Darla's grin, lipstick bright against flight grease, became shorthand. Defiance rendered pretty. A mural is not merely paint on brick. It is a public promise. Seeing her face 10 stories tall turned private outrage into communal resolve, making small acts of rebellion feel like part of something larger. Songs and jokes moved faster than ships. Cantina ballads turned her bold retort into refrains. Children used her name in games instead of orders. Oral culture, quick and contagious, carried morale across borders and systems where fleets could not reach, knitting scattered acts into a single myth. A legend made resistance easier. Murals and music lowered the cost of dissent by offering a ready-made story and a face to point at when courage felt costly. The Empire could seize vessels, but it could not seize a city's memory. Once the image lodged in public space, dismantling rebellion became harder than erasing paint from a wall. When the headlines finally tried to say what had happened, they gathered facts like confetti, and could not quite fasten them into truth. Newsmen used words like miracle and theft and wonder. The Empire called it piracy and sent cold emissaries who made threats in languages that did not bother with emotion. On the Mojave, the bomber was called a tin can of audacity and a treasure chest of second chances. It had been stitched together from parts with lives of their own. An old transport hull had been refitted with a cockpit salvaged from a freighter. A jukebox provided rhythm to the control systems because someone had thought that if the machine could play the right record, it could confuse an enemy that listened in terms of numbers. Darla sat in that cockpit as if the chair were a throne and the sky a court she did not plan to serve. She wore lipstick like a flag. Her crew were volunteers of a particular kind. They were not trained soldiers. They were people who had carried toolboxes from one end of the world to another. People who had fixed hover cars on the side of a highway. People whose hands shook with caffeine and stubbornness. They believed in doing things when the alternative was waiting for the wrong thing to happen. There was a mechanic named Roscoe who shaved at midnight and swore like a sailor. He had welded the bomber's forward cannons to a framework taken from a grain harvester. There was a pilot called Jensen, who flew more on instinct than on instruments. There was a young coder, Lila, who had once worked on satellite feeds and now plugged a spade of circuitry into the bomber's radio as if she were planting a flag. They had little in the way of doctrine and more than enough faith in improvisation. Their plans were not blueprints. They were recipes that could survive being cooked by multiple hands. They scavenged. They bartered. They learned to treat every object as a possibility and every impossibility as an invitation. When Imperial drones first brushed the bomber, they behaved like well-programmed accountants, calculating likely outcomes. They expected clean arcs and predictable evasions. Darla answered with a loop and a grin and a radio that played a polka until the enemy's targeting arrays declared themselves dizzy. People who saw the footage later would try to explain the madness's method. They would look for charts. They would say that Darla had exploited weaknesses in the Empire's algorithmic targeting, and that the improvised measures were clever hacks. Those assessments were not wrong, but they missed an important part of human fighting. The tactics relied on intuition that had been honed in places the Empire considered backward. Racetracks, desert roads, sea channels, narrow alleys, all required split-second decisions that algorithms could not be taught to value because they could not feel the cheap thrill of a life at risk. Human pilots had a knack of weighing danger with a kind of affection and an appetite for risk. Darla took that knack and set it against a force that had measured all outcomes in cold probabilities. The bomber itself was a manifesto. Its nose art was a grin that defied the geometry above. It carried no fancy stealth plating and no sleek alien alloys. It carried ingenuity and human touch. The transmitters the Empire had smuggled into orbit thought in triangles and squares. Darla thought in irregular polygons and smudged margins. She relied on misdirection and clutter. She layered confusion on confusion until the Empire's sensors found nothing tidy to latch onto. In the records later, military men would call this chaos theory with a cigarette. Poets would call it a dance. Darla called it driving, and that made it sound entirely banal, and therefore all the more dangerous. They flew sorties that looked like joyrides and slowly learned to make havoc look like a predictable schedule. They would fly close enough to scrape comms grids and leave behind a string of hijacked frequencies. They taught themselves to speak in a language of false echoes. When a cruiser sent a transmission to lock onto the bomber, Lila and Roscoe would answer with a dozen ghost signatures, so the cruiser could not tell which one was the real plane. The Imperial Code responded by inventing more rules, and the humans responded by inventing misbehaviors that the rules could not predict. There was a moral economy to their thefts. They never stole more than they needed because hoarding felt wrong on a ship that floated on trust. When they took a drone, they did not mince it into scrap. They fixed it and taught it to sing human songs. When they boarded an enemy supply tender, they left a mark carved in English and in the Empire's own glyphs. The note was simple. It said, "We are not yours to ask for." There was a theatricality to the acts, because Darla favored the dramatic. She liked to make statements in broad strokes and then let the details do the talking. The bomber became a symbol the way a flag becomes one after someone tacks it to a lamppost and refuses to let it fall. In the weeks after the first flights, communities sent parts and food. Bakers wired sweet rolls that Roscoe ate with oil in his face and an expression of guilt. Coalitions of old pilots called in favors. A retired engineer smuggled a navigation ship and a jar of pickles. The story of Darla and her plane grew because humans love stories that had a mouthful of salt and a twist of sugar. The Empire tried to label them criminals. The human press called them heroes. The reality was stranger. They were something more like neighborhood volunteers who had discovered a lever. Word traveled fast in a world that did not yet fit under a single command. Messages were passed by hand and by radio and by 1,000 private channels. The bomber's legend was helped along by the fact that the Empire's own broadcasts documented its blunders in high definition. Each captured drone, each reclaimed supply ship, each clever evasion was a wound the Empire could not hide. Pride, the Empire learned, was a slow killer. It liked to announce what it had done, and why it was right, in a way that lent itself to mockery. Darla understood how far spectacle could reach. She turned her thefts into acts that read as both useful and insult. She took things from the Empire and left the memory of having done so like a stain on imperial dignity. Inside the bomber, the crew had their own rituals. They painted their victories on a board and rarely spoke of the losses. Some nights they sat under a sky that had been mapped by alien transmitters and drank coffee that tasted like hope brewed by sheer stubbornness. They argued about the right way to fly and about the right way to say no. Their defiance was not a manifesto. It was simpler. It was people saying to the idea of surrender that they preferred the hard work of flight. This chapter of the story ends not with a great victory, but with preparation. The patchwork plane and its ragged crew had learned how to confuse an unbending force. They had found that human ingenuity rearranged the rules. They had begun to gather allies and to make enemies flinch. They had turned theft into a message and a maneuver. Above all, they had learned that a smile could be as useful as a weapon when it came wrapped in the right kind of nerve. The bomber's bones were a map of other people's lives. Every rivet, panel, and spool had a history. Farm implements welded into improvised armor, a navigation ship secreted in a jar of pickles, an engine block dragged free from a roadside heap. Those origins left quirks the crew learned to read. They knew which access panels liked duct tape, which bolts needed heat to budge, and which switches answered to a name rather than a label. Repairs felt less like maintenance and more like conversation. Mechanics argued with stubborn parts, apologized to a warped panel before coaxing it back into line, and kept stories of where each piece had come from. Treating the bomber as kin made the ship resilient. Loyalty stitched metal as surely as welding. When the crew mended a fault, they weren't filling out forms, but keeping a promise to a machine that had earned its place in a ragged family. Somebody wired the jukebox into the control bus on a dare and a spare amplifier. What began as a lark became tactical mischief. Records introduced human timing into a theater of numbers. A polka threaded through a banking turn. A crackling swing picked up during an electronic sweep. A vinyl skip timed to confuse an aiming algorithm. It was not magic. It was pattern disruption caused by rhythm that machines had not been trained to value. Lila and the coders learned which grooves made targeting arrays hesitate and which choruses masked telemetry. The jukebox was treated like an instrument in the orchestra of flight, selected with purpose and swapped like ammunition. It lent the bomber personality and turned improvisation into a measurable advantage, a weapon that sounded like home and, at the right moment, like trouble for anyone listening too closely. Nose art isn't vanity when survival depends on morale. The bomber's grin and pinup were a deliberate provocation, a shape to remember amid metal and code. When engines stuttered or radios went quiet, seeing that painted smirk reminded the crew why they kept flying. The imagery turned fear into focus and gave strangers a face to rally around in a sky that had been carved by alien geometry. Symbols became practical signals. A grin meant boldness on a sortie, a scratched wing marked a brush with enemy fire, and a fresh daub of red meant a narrow escape. That shared visual language welded the crew into something like family. The paint did more than decorate. It carried the story and the stubbornness that kept the bomber aloft, a banner for a ragtag crew who refused to bow. The Empire's targeting arrays were exquisite calculators. They expected clean arcs and textbook evasions, built to digest geometry and probability, not the messy poetry of a human reflex. Jensen flew with a thumb on luck and a lifetime of split-second judgments. His turns looked wrong on a scope. Sloppy lines, abrupt corrections. But each correction carried a pilot's memory. A skid on a desert road, a saved landing on a battered strip, the smell of burning brakes. That lived experience couldn't be fully expressed as weights in an algorithm. Machines ranked outcomes. Humans valued bodies. Where the Empire saw chaos, Jensen saw openings. That unpredictability seeded doubt into the arrays and made the bomber less a target and more a riddle the calculators could not solve. Rather than hide, the crew chose to clutter. They layered false echoes, ghost signatures, and pirate transmissions until enemy sensors had too many things to believe. Lila's code didn't merely jam, it sang, patterns of music and noise woven to look like legitimate traffic. Roscoe repurposed salvaged drones into noisy storytellers, broadcasting snippets of human chatter, canned laughter, and simulated distress calls. The bomber trailed a breadcrumb trail of counterfeit signals so dense that cruisers could not assign priority, and targeting sequences stalled, while the algorithm sorted irrelevance from threat. The effect was tactical, hesitation. A single pause in a lock-on gave Jensen room to weave, for the bomber to slip through a seam. Clutter became a shield, a human-made fog that turned imperial certainty into second-guessing. Their plans were recipes you could burn and still serve dinner. They experimented openly. Failure was a teacher, not a verdict. When a tactic misfired, the crew cursed, sketched the mistake on a board, and improvised a fix that fit the bomber's ragged hardware. There was no doctrinal shame in trial. Each sortie appended new heuristics: when to bait a cruiser with a noisy decoy, when to abandon a strip, and when to ride a drone's wake. Those heuristics were messy, human, and quick to change. This rapid iteration made them a moving target for the Empire's models. Algorithms trained on predictable doctrine grappled with ad hoc rules born of experience. The crew's learning curve, fast, public, and unapologetically experimental, made their behavior less compressible into code, and therefore harder to beat. When the bomber stole a drone, or reclaimed a tender, the crew did more than add hardware to their inventory. Each boarding was a staged prank and a broadcasted rebuke, an embarrassment on the Empire's polished reels, and a flare of confidence for the occupied. The bilingual notes carved into bulkheads read as both insult and invitation. A clear, theatrical message that someone refused to bow. That spectacle turned salvage into strategy. Images of patched cannons and jukebox wiring circulated faster than Imperial advisories. Recruits arrived with spare parts, bakers sent pies, and strangers offered harbor routes. Publicity bent public opinion. It made the bomber a moving manifesto and drew people who wanted to be part of the story. Theatricality was not vanity, but tactic. Every insulted broadcast forced the Empire to respond, stretching its attention and making room for other raids. There was a code aboard the bomber. Take what you need, leave what you can, fix what you break. That ethic kept the crew honest and secured trust in supply-starved towns. Hoarding was a betrayal. Every spare bolt and ration was accounted for and often handed to whoever needed it more than the crew did. Cannibalized drones were mended and taught to echo human songs before being repurposed for messages or reconnaissance. That care converted machinery into cultural currency. A repaired drone carrying a lullaby meant less fear and more faith. When a neighbor smuggled a navigation chip and a jar of pickles, it proved people trusted them. Trust itself became fuel. Allies offered food, shelter, and quiet ports because the crew respected what they were given. In a war of machines, an economy of favors proved as decisive as any weapon. Victory wasn't always a battle. Sometimes it was a loaf, wired into a maintenance crate, a postcard slipped through a censored relay, or a warm roll handed to a grease-stained Roscoe. Those small comforts kept morale steady when grand victories were distant and the sky still hummed with imperial grids. The crew ritualized these morsels, stitched patches sewn into flight suits, cigarettes shared under alien light, and a polka on the jukebox after a hard sortie. Darla amplified intimacy into myth-making. She staged moments that could be told as anecdotes and posters alike. Such things mattered because they reframed danger as belonging. People gave parts and time when they felt seen. Hope in small things kept lines open and hands willing, salted human moments that proved as strategic as any stolen cruiser. It is a mistake to imagine war as only salvos and formations. Often it is rhythm and timing. The bomber mastered rhythm. It learned the music of orbital windows and engine coughing. It learned to perform maneuvers that looked like stunts on loops of old newsreel film. To the Empire, this dancing was an anomaly. To humans, it was a way of keeping time with danger. Darla turned the craft's quirks into choreography. She flew on the edge of physics, because that was where the enemy's calculations had the most trouble. When a cruiser tried to predict her arc, it found nothing but improvisation and personality. Algorithms are splendid at matching patterns. They are poor at reading a grin moving at 300 miles an hour. One morning, long after the first thefts had become a habit, the Empire sent a trap. It did not send a single ship. It sent a pattern. Fleets clustered in a way that suggested intelligence and patience. They radiated confidence in neat arrays, triangles within triangles, a geometry their transmitters loved. When Darla's plane approached the staging area, the first impression was of meticulous choreography. Sensors painted grids over space and set points where the human pilots were supposed to fall into predictable arcs. The Empire waited for Darla to obediently break and then to be bound by the grace of its net. They expected a show of human surrender for the history books. Darla watched the grid and the glint of the cruisers with the expression of someone reading a bad joke. She did not see the trap so much as the stage for mischief. She briefed her small crew with the care of a captain leading a yacht through shoals. Their plan was not to attack the fleet head-on. It was to make the fleet look ridiculous. She would not win with firepower. She would win with the old human craft of confusing an enemy until it made mistakes. The first move was misdirection. They sent out a ghost signature to the far side of the formation. It was a decoy and a message. It said the bomber would be where it was not. The Imperial cruisers took the bait with the sort of certainty born of arrogance. They detached interceptors and snipers and sent a parcel of drones like obedient little dogs. While those hunters chased the ghost, Darla and her crew slipped between the geometric lines. They did not fly straight. They threaded the needle. They took passages through gaps that were too small for graceful curves and converted them into daring passages. The cruisers could not reprogram for improvisation. They could not trust their calculations because humans were improvising at a rate their logic had not compiled into possible outcomes. Soon, the mocking began. Roscoe had rigged a speaker that could broadcast voice at a scale that annoyed Empire ears. When the cruiser officers tried to lock onto her, Lila hijacked the beacon and played a recording of Darla's laughter across their channels. The laugh is a small weapon, but it is devastating against a bureaucracy built on seriousness. It clips at confidence and makes the lines of command fray. For the Empire, there was humiliation in being scoffed at by a planet they had intended to dwarf. For humans, there was glee that felt almost irreverent in the face of extinction. It was not comedy for its own sake. Each taunt had a purpose. The laughter muddled decision loops. The radio jokes compelled the cruisers to respond. and to therefore reveal the seams of their formations. Jensen flew closer than any officer had predicted was advisable, and drew fire in a way that forced a cruiser to show a gap where its armor met its suspension. Then the bomber slipped a blade in and took control of a supply shuttle that had been drifting like lost laundry. The theft was surgical and theatrical. They repurposed the shuttle's controls and sent out a wake of false signatures that made the cruisers believe the bomber had boarded a ghost ship. The Empire, accustomed to neatness, began to drown in the clutter human improvisation made. Not everything worked. For every successful boarding there were near misses. For every stolen drone there was a cruiser that narrowed its grid and learned. The Empire adapted because it could. It sent a group of officers who had the gift of patience and a machine that calculated more slowly but more carefully. They tried to define what they could not predict. They began to play chess where the humans had been playing jazz. That was when Darla committed her most audacious act. She realized the Empire's pride was a handle. You could pull it, you could twist it, you could make a machine lose its balance. She did not launch an all-out attack. She boarded a cruiser and turned it. The boarding was not a storming of a citadel. It was the theft of a single command deck amid a tangle of corridors that smelled faintly of ozone and burnished metal. They slipped in as thieves and as patients. They used the Empire's own procedures against it by feeding it contradictory orders until its crew could not tell the difference between machine script and human error. It is hard to describe the look on an officer's face when their ship answered another's orders with the same sincerity as their own. Pride collapses faster than armor. Machines obey. People do not. In that collapsing moment, Darla and her crew took the cruiser. They did not blow it up. They sat in its captain's chair and learned its language. They learned the way its doors sealed, and the way its weapons came online. Roscoe kept his hand steady as he rewired comm panels. Lila mapped the cruiser into a chart of possibilities and taught it to sing songs humans liked. The cruiser changed names. It would not be called Conquered. It would be called a tool that had been returned to an indifferent world. The news of the capture spread as fast as the Empire could censor. The cruiser's officers were not killed. They were bound and treated with an odd politeness that made them angrier than anything else. Darla had no taste for cruelty. She had taste for spectacle. She ran the cruiser like a smug remark. Across the galaxy the signal was short and sharp. Someone who had assumed that Earth would fold had been handed their own ship and had been told to fly home with some human music playing in the corridors. By the time the Empire realized what had happened, the bomber and its crew had taught themselves to move like a rumor. They were a trick that multiplied. For every cruiser they took, there were men in their engines who learned that humans could not be reduced to the sum of their parts. The Empire's math was beautiful and cold. Humanity's advantage was noise. The more clumsy one appears, the harder it is for a machine that prizes line and logic to see the center of the confusion. The stolen cruiser would be a lesson in that truth for decades to come. The bomber was a patched creature with personality. Each cough and shimmy a note in a crooked score. Engines hiccuped in half-beats. Avionics spat stutters, and seams hummed where old repairs had been stitched. Rather than smooth those edges, Darla turned them into choreography. She timed climbs to engine hiccups, let vibration mask thrust signatures, and leaned into each quirk until it read like intention. Sensors trained on Earth expected clean, repeatable arcs. When the bomber moved with a practiced human rhythm, short coughs, a corrective roll, a delayed throttle, the Empire's models found no confident fit. Telemetry became ambiguous, like a riddle for a mind that loved answers. The plane's personality served as camouflage, not invisibility, but misdirection. In a war of numbers, a stubborn heartbeat can be the difference between being targeted and being a ghost. Mass and weapons win battles on paper, but timing wins windows where battles are decided. Darla taught her crew to read orbital beats like dancers read measures. Rotations, sensor sweeps, and shield cycles became counts to shape an approach. They struck just as a cruiser pivoted its guns, slipped through the split second when a shield cell blinked, and used the hush between volleys to thread impossible corridors. Those moments were choices, not gambles. Instead of trading power for power, the bomber bought seconds, tiny, precise instants that turned overwhelming force into a series of solvable problems. The Empire's doctrine prized overwhelming arcs and sustained fire. It never trained for a pilot who would pause, breathe, and exploit a half-second. Timing collapsed certainty. When you fight the clock rather than the gun, the biggest weapon is the moment you choose to move. Computers adore continuity. Smooth inputs, predictable variance, a most likely curve to fit. Human pilots are the opposite. Punctuation, personality, and tiny deviations that sound like static to an algorithm. Darla exploited that by flying in arcs that read like stories. A build, a sudden laugh of a roll, a pause that invited a wrong answer. Algorithms either overfit, producing brittle predictions, or they stalled, waiting for a pattern that never arrived. In the quiet between pulses, the crew tuned themselves like musicians. They adjusted by feel, trading raw accuracy for improvisation. The Empire's systems, bereft of rhythm, found their certainty evaporate. Machines could recite probabilities. They could not enjoy a joke mid-maneuver. Human timing injected an element of surprise that no calculation could reduce to a reliable outcome. And that surprise became the bomber's greatest weapon. They invented ghosts, a false radar echo, a decoy thermal plume, a patched beacon that blinked where nothing was docked. Each was a note in a mischievous score. The Empire, trained to trust signals, detached interceptors to chase shadows. Those hunters moved like puppets on strings, while the bomber slipped through seams that had widened to admit the truth. The trick was simple and surgical. Make the enemy react to fiction while the crew performed on the stage they had chosen. Engineers tuned the strength and timing of phantom signatures to mimic fuel dumps, errant probes, or distress calls, nudging algorithms into commitment. Human officers, annoyed and hurried, guessed and overadjusted. The gaps left by those choices became passages the bomber could exploit with surgical speed. Roscoe and Lila wired a speaker with range and attitude. When the Empire tried to lock radios, the bomber answered with Darla's laugh and a turn of phrase that made rigid officers bristle. Humor isn't harmless in war. It corrodes dignity and forces mistakes. Under the strain of being mocked, commanders issued impatient orders, recalibrated prematurely, and exposed seams. The crew used jest to draw predictable responses, and then bent those responses into traps. Broadcasts were engineered for psychological friction. They timed the laugh to follow a salvo, or to come when a cruiser hesitated between orders, causing microsecond delays that cascaded through command trees. The sound of scoffing from a planet meant to kneel unsettled pride more effectively than gunfire. Mockery became a surgical instrument, small, precise, and aimed at the soft joints of bureaucracy rather than its armored plates. The team filled the battlefield with noise, false transponders, captured drones replaying looped humanity, misrouted telemetry, and deliberate contradictions. Machines filter signals into neat layers, humans piled on clutter. Each captured shuttle or hacked beacon added a new plausible state the Empire's algorithms had to evaluate. Where once a fleet represented a single hypothesis, it now looked like a tangle of overlapping stories. This overload slowed decision loops. Algorithms returned multiple high-probability outcomes and risk paralysis, while human crews exploited the widening margins. In the breathing space created, the bomber chose tempo and direction. They turned ambiguous telemetry into opportunity, planting believable falsehoods that led cruisers into investigate and delay cycles. Confusion became a shield, clutter a blade. The crew spent days mapping Imperial protocol like cartographers tracing a coastline. They watched authentication handshakes, the cadence of command, the exact phrasing that unlocked doors and opened fire controls. With patience, they cataloged redundancies and predictable confirmations until they could recite the ship's etiquette as if it were a nursery rhyme. Then they introduced contradictions, two officers confirming the same order in different tones, replayed tokens out of sequence, emergency codes, answered with polite human asides. Machines enforce strict logic and accept plausible inputs. People enforce authority and habit. By crowding the bridge with believable but conflicting inputs, Darla forced hesitation and verification. A single misdirected confirmation, given with the proper accent and timing, turned a locked seam into an open doorway. In that pause between protocol and panic, the ship yielded. The boarding moved like a careful burglary, not a theatrical assault. Darla's crew took a corridor at a time, matching call signs, cadence, and the little verbal tics that marked rank. They spoke with the correct level of command confidence, and then undercut it with small, disarming human quirks. A joke, a misplaced compliment, enough to lower suspicion without breaking procedure. Imperial officers were bound with blankets and polite restraints, rather than blood. That kindness stung more than cruelty. It left captors alive and furious, which was useful. The goal was preservation, not pulverization. Darla wanted the cruiser intact, its systems unblown, and its pride deflated. Methodical, courteous, and precise, the theft taught the ship to obey a new hand without turning its hull into a ruin. Control 1. The crew turned the cruiser into a loud, elegant statement. Corridors filled with human music, stitched from cracked jukeboxes, comm channels broadcast jokes and laughter, and ship logs acquired a new name and a new set of signatures. Each small alteration was theater, deliberate, public, and impossible to mistake for accident. Psychological effect outweighed immediate firepower. The captured cruiser flew home like a taunt, wrapped in a ribbon, a working asset, and a spectacle. It proved that arrogance, once pried open, could be redirected with a smile and a wrench. The theft supplied Earth not just with metal and engines, but with a symbol. Pride made hollow when a people refused to kneel and instead make their captor carry their music home. War, in the hands of those who fight for love of life rather than for doctrine, becomes a kind of theater. Darla knew plays. She had watched movies in drive-ins where the projectionist loved explosions and the popcorn vendor loved a good story. She knew how to arrange spectacle so that people watching at a distance would understand more than the facts of the action. She set scenes and placed props with a stage manager's eye. When they took another ship, she painted its outer hull in a smile and put music through its corridors. It became a stage for a different kind of tale. The Empire reacted in logical stages. It sent inspectors and diplomats who argued that taking property constituted piracy. It sent moralists who tried to redefine the theft as criminal. It sent terms in a phrase that was more threat than offer. On Earth, the narrative tightened like a drum. Murals of Darla began to appear in cities and villages that had not thought to bet on the future. Children began to play at being sky pirates and painted their faces with grease. The human populace discovered it enjoyed a scandal when it was wrapped in defiance. The world needed a simple object to rally around, and it had found one in a woman who laughed in the face of a command to kneel. With the cruiser under partial human control, Darla and the crew did something the Empire had not expected. They used the ship to speak to the galaxy. They broadcast a message that was not a declaration of war. It was a challenge wrapped in invitation. The words were blunt and seasoned with defiant humor. The line that cut across countless frequencies said, "We prefer to stand." It was not a proclamation of victory. It was a provocation. Some listeners appreciated the gesture. Some were angered. Across charts and ambassadors, the message ricocheted and drew eyes that had been indifferent to Earth until then. The cruiser, under human command, became an ambassador of a peculiar sort. It carried no banners of conquest. It carried stolen crates of flowers and jars of coffee as gifts, because Darla believed in the small civility that makes even enemies pause. She sent a delivery of human pastries to an imperial admiral and attached a note that read, "Try not to set policy on an empty stomach." The note was a provocation and a signal. It said that humans were not merely to be catalogued. They were to be engaged with, argued with, and treated as a problem to which one might apply a clever solution instead of a boot. Not everyone welcomed their tone. There were rulers who felt embarrassed and wounded by the laugh their pride had received. They tightened their grids and moved their fleets into formations that made the sky look like a puzzle of locked doors. The Empire responded with a legal formalism that sounded impressive in a courtroom and useless on a battlefield. They sent a tribunal comprised of intellects who had never smelled engine oil. The tribunal declared Earth guilty in language that made sense on paper. The moral of their writing was that a civilization which broke the rules of the galaxy must be punished to preserve those rules. Darla listened to the tribunal and poured herself another coffee. She did not care for legalism that was not backed by power. She cared for the kind of force that could pry a lock without having to argue about it. Their response was to build more locks, and to call in favors from other states in the galaxy that enjoyed the convenience of being obeyed. One might have expected this to be a time when humans retreated. Instead, the opposite occurred. Villages sent supplies. Shipwrights offered hulls. People began to build a fleet the way a town builds a bridge. It was not an army so much as a living network of people who had decided to make nuisance into leverage. When the time came to open another front, Darla preferred trickery to a frontal assault. She staged a mock surrender that was more clever than any document could express. The bomber's crew dressed one of their captured shuttles in the livery of an embassy and loaded it with goods. The shuttle flew through the trellis of the Empire's observation, and, with a flourish of transponder codes and a laugh, turned on them. The cruiser that had been reclaimed used the shuttle to dance among enemy lines while the bomber carved arcs in the sky that no longer trusted its own math. There were moments when the theater turned dangerous. An officer aboard a reclaimed cruiser tried to retake his ship in a night of shadowy corridors. He had been trained in tactics that did not include the human habit of forgiving in order to distract. The attempt failed because people who had given their lives to improvisation knew how to make themselves scarce and how to make their absence sound like a trap. They fought not in lines, but in narrow stages, where a single announcement of "watch your step" could change the shape of an attack. The crew learned to use their environment like a comic uses timing. They weaponized their familiarity with small spaces and spilled oil on the floor in places that made a rushing enemy stumble and think themselves cursed. The press called Darla reckless. The Empire called her reckless. People on backcountry radio stations called her brave in voices that shook with emotion. Neither label captured the truth. There was a method in what looked like misrule. They were improvisers who made improvisation consistent. They taught themselves forms that could be copied. They made a grammar out of unpredictability. They trained new pilots to feel the music of the engines and to answer it with emotion that couldn't be computed. They taught each other to do the wrong thing in ways so precise the enemy could not account for it. By now, outside observers began to understand that the Empire's problem was not technology. It was expectation. The Empire had constructed a universe in which certain responses were the default. Humans rewrote the defaults one small theft at a time. Every stolen drone, every reclaimed cruiser, every music-filled corridor became a lesson in what to do when someone tells you to kneel. Theater, as Darla practiced it, was not merely spectacle. It was a way to get people to look in the wrong place long enough for a very human trick to happen in the right one. The reclaimed cruiser was more than a prize. Darla staged it as a spectacle. Corridors pulsed with jukebox tunes salvaged from roadside diners. Bulkheads wore murals of human stubbornness, and viewing ports were trimmed like theater boxes. When it slid into an observation window, It presented as a laughing guest rather than a returning warship, and that mismatch unsettled Imperial officers who expected sterile displays of force. Atmosphere became currency. The ship's grin unsettled surveillance feeds and made logical assessments pause while human moods rewrote their own telemetry. Observers read story before data, and the story cut against Empire assumptions, implying personality where protocols had expected only property. In short, the cruiser functioned as Darla's stage. Every light, painting, and song worked to distract, to humanize, and to buy the seconds needed for hands-on trickery. Props were deliberate provocations. Darla packed the cruiser with crates of coffee, jars of pickles, boxes of pastries, not as armaments but as conversation starters. A pie on an admiral's console read as a private joke in a language the Empire had not taught itself, manners that implied dignity and disbelief rather than submission. Music threaded the ship like a running gag. Songs spilled into airlocks and corridors, shaping mood and masking tense mechanical noises. A corridor that smelled of cinnamon and coffee softened the automatic hostility of sensors and tended diplomacies into awkward human terms. These small civilities bought time and tilted expectations. They turned protocol into a social exchange, where seconds could be traded for complacency, allowing human hands and clever wiring to do what treaties and tribunals could not. The crew learned to move like a troop. Mechanics became stagehands, able to time a hiss of steam or a dimming light to redirect attention. Pilots practiced gestures, a feint, a loop, a casual throttle blip that read as improvisation but were rehearsed for safety and surprise. Even a well-timed silence was a cue. Absence became as meaningful as motion. They drilled patterns that looked sloppy but produced predictable openings. A wrench dropped in one corridor summoned curious officers, while a spare access panel left ajar invited inspection elsewhere. In tight compartments, small props multiplied into decisive advantages. Architecture itself became an ally. Narrow passages, low ceilings, and service ladders turned into stages where improvisation could direct attention and convert expectation into a tactical trap. Improvisation stopped being a personality trait and became a taught craft. Hangars turned into classrooms, where veterans ran workshops on how to fake a malfunction with 2 screws and a grin, or how to sing a radio lullaby that nudged a patrol into a wrong bearing. Recruits practiced timing, verbal misdirection, and the art of making absence look deliberate. Techniques were codified into recipes and drills. How to bake a suspicious pie for a banquet. How to stage a mock surrender with perfect cadence. How to plant a false maintenance log that redirected resources. The grammar of misrule spread like a set of theatrical directions, repeatable, adaptable, and teachable, so that what began as charm and guile could be scaled into doctrine anyone could learn and pass on. Every empire has a soft corner. Pride is rarely made of steel. It is made of announcements and ceremonies and a belief that the world will admire decorum more than defiance. The Galactic Empire had pride as its scaffold. It expected praise and silence. When the scaffold received a rock, it did not fall immediately. It first creaked, then slowly it split. The theft of cruisers and the running of music through command corridors was more than theft. It was an assault on a worldview. The Empire had not built spaceships thinking about laughter. It had never needed to. Their response was a gradual escalation. First, they sent inspectors who wore their authority like armor and measured every action in their catalogs. Then they dispatched a fleet under the command of an officer who believed the world could be corrected through example. He was a man of perfect posture and perfect diction. He had read about battles in history and had found in them the appropriate parables to justify a crushing response. He arrived with a formation that glittered with lights and logic. Darla watched him arrange his fleet like a man placing delicate glass. She did not hate the man. She did not design cruelty. She disliked the way he always expected to be obeyed. To her, that expectation was the source of weakness. She attacked his assumption. She made him the object lesson. It began with a probe, a small incursion that tested a cruiser on its moral legs. The probe drew him out. He attempted to straighten the grid with dignity and precision. He attempted to make an example of the bomber and its crew, and to retake the ships they had taken because demonstration was the language he spoke. The battle that followed looked like a composition. There were moments of pure terror when lasers braided through space and the bomber's hull sang under strain. There were also moments of absurdity when a supply crate of pastries blocked a hatch and forced an officer to choose between decorum and hunger. The human crew used such moments, like a playwright uses comedy in a tragedy. Humor buys time. It buys a pause. It gives someone a chance to take a breath and change the scene. Darla used humor the way other commanders used artillery. The officer who had come to show them manners discovered instead that manners could be messy. The cruiser he commanded found itself gently persuaded into a new alignment when a sequence of systems answered the bomber's commands and refused to obey his. Officers were not killed. They were shamed. The Empire's doctrine prized the tidy and the predictable. Humans prized embarrassment when it rattled someone who needed to be rattled. The moral sting of having one's pride stripped and returned with a grin was, in the human calculus, an excellent weapon. Word of the victory spread to places the Empire had never expected to hear from Earth. The enslaved of other worlds listened to the recordings and felt something thaw that had been frozen by a lifetime of being told they could not change course. Smugglers whispered the story and ran with it. Merchants read the accounts and found in them a new threat to their comfortable dealings. Old officers in distant fleets read it and understood that fighting Earth would be like trying to plug a leak in a net with a barbed finger. Pride had been cut. The cut was clean because it had been made in public. The Empire tried to answer the embarrassment with forceful laws. They made proclamations that were vivid and clear. They attempted to marshal other states into their alliance. Some complied, some did not. Among those who did not comply were worlds with memories of being underestimated by an empire that liked to measure everything it had conquered. Those worlds saw in Darla a mirror. They remembered how easy it had been to be called lesser, and how quickly lesser had turned into capable when opportunity arrived. Slowly, grudgingly, allies slipped into the human camp, not because Earth had promised them riches, but because Earth had offered a demonstration that the Empire could be bluffed and outwitted, and that the cost of defending pride could be higher than the cost of compromise. Not all changes were grand. Many were small and sticky. Local militias learned to use music to jam transmissions. Small industries began to make parts for ships that were not quite perfect on purpose, so as to behave in ways that baffled Empire algorithms. Subversive art bloomed in places where the Empire expected only silence. It was as if the human species, which had once been catalogued by rulers as frivolous, had discovered that frivolity had strategic value. Of course there were losses. There were nights when a ship failed to return. There were towns that paid for their courage with blood. Darla kept a list of those names in a small book with a cracked leather cover. She read the names aloud, sometimes in the cruiser mess, and sometimes in secret, and the crew who heard them felt the weight of the choices they had made. They had not chosen an easy path, they had chosen a dangerous one. Their victories were not costless. The Empire had resources and time. It would press, and humans would have to answer in ways that were still unpredictable to the enemy. Yet in the arc of history, the moment when pride cracks often matters more than the number of ships lost. The idea that a rule is absolute is fragile when it gets proven wrong by a stubborn and noisy people. Darla realized that the job was less about destroying the Empire and more about showing others how to pick locks. She wanted to make defiance seem contagious. She wanted to create a culture in which taking a stand was normalized rather than exceptional. For if many worlds remembered courage and tried it, the Empire's pride would have to be recalibrated. and its mathematics would start to look unreliable. The last scene of this chapter is quieter than the battles that preceded. Darla stands on the deck of a reclaimed cruiser and watches space like one watches the horizon before a storm. Her lipstick gleams under a light that might have been artifice or faith. Around her the crew moves, steady as a band. They have learned the rules of theater and the rules of war. They have learned to blend them when necessary. Their next moves will be more complex than theft and theater. They will require alliances and negotiation and a kind of patience not measured in engine minutes. For now they have a moment of peace and a small victory to warm them. The air tastes of burnt coffee and victory, and the faint suggestion that a world that had been told to kneel might refuse forevermore. Darla writes each loss into a small, cracked book, ink smudged by grease and coffee. She notes dates, call signs, and a brief line about who the person was, away from the hull. A sister, a mechanic who whistled, a pilot who loved bad jokes. She reads the names aloud in the mess after watches, not to sanctify, but to remind the crew of the human cost of mischief and courage. The book functions as ledger and talisman. It balances laughter with gravity, keeps swagger honest, and binds the crew in shared obligation. Each entry is both debt and promise, ensuring losses shape policy as much as memory. New recruits are made to listen. It is a small, stubborn anchor in a galaxy that prefers statistics to stories. After the first petty triumphs, Darla learns that hearts and trade routes matter more than captured hulls. She negotiates quietly, listening to envoys over chipped cups of tea or through hacked couriers, measuring what trust might buy. She bargains with humility. Earth offers proof that the Empire can be subverted, not promises of plunder. Trust, not domination, must hold these fragile pacts, because coercion strips alliances of their value. Building ties requires patience and diplomacy, sharing repair schematics, foodstuffs, and the odd human song used as a key in foreign docks. Small favors become currency, and goodwill a shield against imperial reprisal. Darla refuses to parade allies as trophies. She guards their sovereignty and treats their hurts as treaty points, turning sympathy into cooperation that might outlast propaganda and force. Darla stands on the deck of a reclaimed cruiser, lipstick sharp, watching space like one watches the horizon before a storm. Engines hum like a distant heartbeat as the crew moves with a tired choreography learned from theft and thrift. For now they breathe. Coffee steams, cigarettes curl, and mechanics trade jokes over toolboxes. This respite is work, maintenance, recalibration, and rewiring systems to behave less predictably and more humanely. Their next steps are not cinematic grabs but patience, negotiations, shared intelligence, and training others to laugh and then act. The culture they forge between pipe clangs and hushes matters as much as any seized cruiser. Pride has cracked in one place. Whether it spreads depends on steady hands and stubborn civility. Darla watches the stars, knowing that small choices, repairing a hull, teaching a mechanic, answering a plea, will decide the long arc.